Connecticut, 1938. Inside the drafting rooms of the Vought Sikorsky Aircraft Company, a team of engineers led by Rex Basil was staring at a set of blueprints that defied the laws of conventional aviation. The United States Navy had issued a challenge. War was looming in Europe and the Pacific, and the Navy knew its current fleet of biplanes and slow monoplanes would be slaughter for the modern German and Japanese fighters. They needed a machine that could fly faster, climb higher, and hit harder than anything else in the sky. They wanted speed, pure, unadulterated speed. Rex Basil didn't just want to build a fast plane, he wanted to build the fastest plane in history. And to do that, he decided to do something radical. He wouldn't build a fuselage and then find an engine to fit inside it. He would do the opposite. He would take the most powerful engine in existence and build the smallest possible airframe. That engine was the Pratt Whitney R2800 double Wasp. It was a monster, an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that generated a staggering 2,000 horsepower. At the time, no fighter plane had ever utilized such raw power. It was an engine designed for massive bombers, not agile dogfighters. When they bolted it onto the test stand, the ground shook. But this beast created a massive engineering headache. To harness 2,000 horsepower, the engine needed a propeller that could bite into the air with terrifying force. The engineers calculated that they needed a massive, three-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller measuring 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter. It was the largest propeller ever attached to a fighter plane. And here lay the problem. If they mounted this giant propeller on a standard straight wing, the blades would chop into the flight deck on takeoff. To clear the ground, the landing gear struts would have to be incredibly long, like stilts. But this was a Navy plane. It had to land on the heaving, pitching deck of an aircraft carrier. Long, spindly landing gear would snap like dry twigs under the impact of a carrier landing. It seemed like an impossible paradox. They needed the big prop for speed, but the big prop made the landing gear too weak for the ship. Rex Basil's solution was a stroke of genius that would create an icon. He looked at the blueprints and bent the wings. Instead of extending straight out from the fuselage, the wings would droop down towards the ground at the root and then angle sharply back up. It was an inverted gull wing design. This wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was pure, brutal function. By bending the wings down, the landing gear could be mounted at the lowest point of the bend. This allowed the struts to be short, stout, and strong enough to survive a carrier landing, while still keeping the massive propeller high enough to clear the deck. It gave the plane a menacing, predatory look. It didn't look like a machine, it looked like a bird of prey hunching its shoulders before a dive. On May 29, 1940, the prototype, designated the F4U-1, rolled onto the runway in Stratford, Connecticut. It was sleek, dark, and intimidating. When the pilot fired up the R2800, the roar was deafening. The plane didn't taxi, it prowled. During its initial flight tests, the impossible happened. The Corsair tore through the sky, shattering records. On a level flight between Stratford and Hartford, it clocked a speed of 405 miles per hour. The Navy officials checking their stopwatches couldn't believe it. It was the first American fighter to break the 400-mile-per-hour barrier. It was faster than the Army's planes. It was faster than the Japanese Zero. It was faster than anything the Germans had. But speed comes with a price. The massive nose, stretching 12 feet in front of the cockpit to house the giant engine, completely blocked the pilot's view on the ground. The torque of the engine was so powerful, it threatened to flip the plane over on takeoff. Vought had built a monster. They had succeeded in wrapping an airframe around a beast, but as the Navy was about to find out, Building the beast was the easy part. Taming it would be a different story entirely. The bent-wing bird was born, but it was not yet ready for war. September 1942. Aboard the escort carrier USS Sangamon. The mood on the flight deck was tense. The Navy pilots were gathered to witness the carrier trials of the Vought F4U Corsair. On paper, this machine was the answer to their prayers. It was the first American fighter capable of exceeding 400 miles per hour. It climbed like a rocket and carried 6 .50 caliber machine guns. It was supposed to be the zero killer. But as the first Corsair entered the landing pattern, the men on the deck realized that Vought hadn't built a savior. They had built a monster. To understand why the Corsair terrified its own pilots, you have to sit in the cockpit. Because the massive R-2800 engine needed a huge fuel tank, the engineers had placed the main fuel cell in the fuselage, directly in front of the pilot. This pushed the cockpit 3 feet backward. The result was a disaster for visibility. When a Corsair pilot approached the carrier for a landing, the nose of the plane, stretching 14 feet in front of him, pointed up into the air. From his seat, the pilot could see the sky, the clouds, and the majestic engine cowling. What he could not see was the aircraft carrier he was trying to land on. It was like trying to park a Cadillac in a garage while driving from the trunk with the hood popped open. The pilot had to fly a curved, turning approach, keeping the carrier deck in sight out of the side window until the very last second. Then he had to straighten out, cut the power, and pray. On that September day, the prayers went unanswered. The prototype roared in. The pilot cut the throttle. The Corsair dropped like a stone. But when the wheels hit the wooden deck, the plane didn't stick. The landing gear struts, designed by engineers who were thinking about rough dirt runways, were too stiff. They acted like pogo sticks. Slam! Boing! The 12,000-pound fighter bounced into the air. It floated over the arresting wires. The tailhook, which was supposed to snag a cable and stop the plane, swung uselessly through empty space. The Corsair crashed into the safety barrier, a tangle of steel and wire designed to stop runaway planes from killing the crew on the forward deck. It wasn't an isolated incident. It kept happening. And then there was the torque roll. The engine was so powerful that if a pilot panicked during a bad landing and slammed the throttle forward to go around, the sudden torque of the massive propeller would twist the entire airframe. The left wing would dip, and the plane would flip onto its back, slamming the pilot into the deck upside down. The Navy instructors watched in horror. They saw young, inexperienced pilots, ensigns fresh out of flight school, struggling to tame the beast. These kids didn't have the hours or the instincts to handle a plane that wanted to kill them as much as the enemy did. A grim nickname began to circulate in the mess halls: the Ensign Eliminator. Others called it the bent-wing widowmaker. The Navy brass looked at the accident reports. They looked at the shattered landing gears, the burning wreckage on the flight decks, and the terrified faces of the pilots. They made a cold calculation. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was coming online. It was slower than the Corsair, and it wasn't as sexy, but it was stable. It was easy to fly. An ensign could land a Hellcat on the first try and walk away. The verdict was handed down in late 1942. The F4U Corsair is unfit for carrier duty. It was a crushing blow. The fastest plane in the world was rejected by the very service that asked for it. The Navy didn't want it. But there was another group of aviators who were desperate. The United States Marine Corps was fighting for its life in the jungle hellholes of the Solomon Islands. They were flying from dirt airstrips, not moving ships. They didn't care about bouncing landing gears. They didn't care about poor visibility over the nose. They just needed something, anything that could catch a Mitsubishi Zero. If the Navy won't take it, the Marine commanders said, we will. So the Ensign Eliminator was exiled. It was kicked off the boats and sent to the islands. The Navy thought they were getting rid of a failure. They didn't realize they were handing the Marines a weapon that would become the most feared legend of the Pacific. The beast had been caged, but now it was about to be released into the wild. February 1943. The Solomon Islands. The air over Guadalcanal was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation. For 6 months, the United States Marine Corps had been fighting a desperate war in the mud. But the real terror was in the sky. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the undisputed king of the Pacific. It was a masterpiece of Japanese engineering, feather-light, impossibly agile, and flown by samurai of the air who had been training for years. In a dogfight, the Zero could turn inside any American plane. If a Wildcat or a P-40 tried to turn with a Zero, it was a death sentence. The American pilots were losing. They were tired, their machines were outclassed, and morale was hanging by a thread. Then, a strange sound began to echo over Henderson Field. It wasn't the low, throaty rumble of the Grumman Wildcats. It was a high-pitched, terrifying shriek. It sounded like a banshee screaming as it tore through the fabric of the sky. The Marines on the ground looked up and saw a silhouette that didn't make sense. It had bent wings like a seagull. It had a nose that stretched out forever. And it was fast, incredibly fast. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF 124, had arrived, and they had brought the F4U Corsair. The first engagements were a disaster. The St. Valentine's Day massacre saw the new Corsairs swatted out of the sky because the pilots tried to dogfight the Zeros on Japanese terms. They tried to turn, they died. But the survivors learned quickly. They realized that the Corsair wasn't a ballerina, it was a brick with a rocket engine. It was heavy, armored, and built like a tank. The Japanese pilots, used to fighting the sluggish Wildcats, were about to face a rude awakening. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, who would become the first Corsair ace, described the change in tactics. You don't fight the Zero, you destroy it. The Corsair had a secret weapon, the boom and zoom. The F4U could climb faster than the Zero. It could dive faster than the Zero. In fact, if a Zero pilot tried to dive after a Corsair, the fragile wings of the Japanese plane would rip off from the G-force. The tactic became brutal and simple. The Corsair pilots would climb to 20,000 feet, hovering above the Japanese formation like hawks. Then they would tip the nose over. The Pratt Whitney engine would roar, and the air rushing into the wing root oil coolers would generate that signature two-tone whistle. Scree. To the Japanese pilots, that sound became the noise of inevitable death. They called it whistling death. A Corsair would dive on a Zero at 450 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot would have seconds to react. He'd pull back on the stick, trying to turn, but the Corsair wasn't turning, it was slashing. The American pilot would unleash a half-second burst from 6.5 caliber machine guns. The result was catastrophic. The Zero, built without armor protection for the pilot or self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight, would simply disintegrate. One incendiary round into the wing tanks, and the Mitsubishi would turn into a fireball. And if the Japanese pilot managed to get a shot off, the 7.7mm machine guns of the Zero would plank harmlessly off the Corsair's thick armor plate behind the cockpit. The F4U could take a beating that would ground any other plane and still fly home. By the summer of 1943, the skies over the Solomons had changed. The hunters had become the prey. The Black Sheep Squadron and others were racking up kills at a staggering rate. The psychological impact was immense. The Japanese pilots realized that their agility meant nothing if they couldn't catch the enemy. The Corsair dictated the terms of the fight. It decided when to attack and when to leave. The The reign of the Zero was over. The bent-wing bird had arrived, and it was hungry. By late 1943, the United States Navy faced a frustrating paradox. They possessed the most powerful, fastest, and most lethal fighter plane in the world, the Vought F4U Corsair. Yet this magnificent machine was banned from the very place it was built to operate, the aircraft carrier. While the Corsair was busy becoming a legend in the hands of the Marines on land, the Navy's carrier decks were dominated by the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was a good plane, sturdy, reliable, and easy to fly. It was the safe choice. The Corsair, with its tendency to bounce on landing and its long nose that blinded the pilot, had been branded a failure for shipboard operations. The Ensign Eliminator was exiled to island airstrips. But across the Atlantic Ocean, a different navy was about to change history. The British Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm received the Corsair under the Lend-Lease program. Unlike the Americans, the British didn't have the luxury of choice. They were fighting for survival in the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean against the Luftwaffe. They needed a high-performance fighter, and they needed it yesterday. They didn't care if the Corsair was dangerous, they only cared if it was fast. When British pilots first looked at the Corsair, they saw the same problems the Americans did. The nose was too long, you couldn't see the deck, the landing gear was too stiff, but instead of rejecting the plane, they decided to fix the way they flew it. The British aviators developed a radical new landing technique. The American manual said to line up miles behind the ship and fly a straight, long approach. The British threw the manual in the trash. They invented the continuous turn. Instead of flying straight, the British pilot would approach the carrier in a constant banking left turn. By keeping the plane banked, the pilot didn't have to look over the long nose. He could look out the side of the cockpit, keeping the carrier deck in view through the side glass until the very last second. He would level the wings only when he was directly over the arresting wires, cut the throttle, and drop. It was a terrifying maneuver that required nerves of steel, but it solved the visibility problem instantly. Simultaneously, British engineers tackled the bounce. They discovered that the hydraulic fluid in the landing gear struts, the oleo shocks, was creating too much pressure. They simply modified a valve to let the gear compress more softly. The bounce disappeared. The Corsair now stuck to the deck like glue. By 1944, the situation in the Pacific had changed darker. As the U.S. Navy pushed closer to Japan, a new and terrifying threat emerged, the kamikaze. The Japanese began hurling suicide planes at the American fleet. The sturdy Hellcats were excellent dogfighters, but they sometimes struggled to catch the fastest Japanese planes diving from high altitudes. The Navy needed an interceptor with raw speed. They needed a plane that could climb like a rocket and chase down the divine wind. They looked at what the British were doing. They saw Corsairs operating safely from the decks of HMS Victorious and HMS Illustrious. The U.S. Navy swallowed its pride and adopted the British techniques. In late 1944, the ban was lifted. The bent-wing bird was ordered back to sea. Squadrons like VBF-112 aboard the USS Randolph were among the first to trade their Hellcats for Corsairs. The pilots were apprehensive at first. The ghost of the Ensign Eliminator still haunted the mess halls. But as they practiced the new curved approach, they realized the beast had been tamed. The return of the Corsair to the carrier decks transformed the Pacific War. It provided the fleet with a big blue blanket of protection. The Corsair could carry a massive bomb load to smash ground targets, drop its ordnance, and then instantly become a 400-mile-per-hour fighter to defend the fleet.
The exile was over. The plane that had been rejected as a failure had returned to become the undisputed king of the carrier deck, proving that with enough ingenuity, even a monster could be taught to land on a postage stamp in the middle of the ocean.
Spring 1945. The Pacific War had entered its final, most brutal phase. The days of the swirling, romantic dogfights over Guadalcanal were long gone. The Japanese Navy had been smashed, its carriers sunk, and its veteran pilots were dead. But as the U.S. forces closed the ring around the Japanese home islands, the enemy changed. They stopped fighting for victory and started fighting for annihilation. On the black sands of Iwo Jima and the muddy ridges of Okinawa, the Japanese defenders had gone underground. They had dug miles of tunnels, caves, and concrete bunkers. They were invisible, lethal, and willing to fight to the last man. The Marines on the ground, pinned down by machine gun fire and mortars, looked to the sky for salvation, and they found it in the F4U Corsair. By 1945, the bent-winged bird had evolved into a terrifying force of nature. It was no longer just a fighter, it was a mud-moving monster. The engineers had fitted it with racks for heavy ordnance. It could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, more than some twin-engine bombers earlier in the war. It carried high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs, that could crack concrete bunkers like eggshells. But the most fearsome weapon in its arsenal was a new gelatinous horror called napalm. The Corsair pilots developed a tactic that required nerves of steel. They called it close air support, but the Marines called it saving our skins. A Corsair would come in low, so low the pilot could see the desperate faces of the men he was supporting. The massive R-2800 engine would scream, the whistling death sound now signaling salvation for the Americans and an inferno for the Japanese. The pilot would release the silver canisters. They would tumble end over end, smashing into the cave entrances and pillboxes. A wall of liquid fire would erupt, sucking the oxygen out of the air and incinerating everything within 100 yards. The Corsairs are the sweethearts of Okinawa, a mariner private wrote home. They stay with us, they sleep with us, they clear the path. But while the Corsairs were burning the enemy out of the caves, they still had a job to do in the air. The Japanese had unleashed the kamikaze, the divine wind. Waves of suicide planes, piloted by young men with barely enough training to take off, were thrown against the U.S. fleet. Their goal was simple: turn themselves into human missiles and sink the American carriers. The Corsair, with its immense speed and rate of climb, became the fleet's big blue blanket. It was the premier interceptor. The Hellcats were reliable, but the Corsairs were fast. When the radar pickets spotted incoming kamikazes, the Corsairs were vectored out. The engagements were short and violent. The Corsairs would dive from high altitude, their engines howling, catching the desperate Japanese planes before they could reach the ships. The 20mm cannons on the newer F4U models tore the flimsy suicide planes apart in mid-air. It wasn't a dogfight, it was an execution. One Corsair pilot, finding himself surrounded by 6 Japanese fighters, didn't run. He turned into them. In less than 2 minutes, he had splashed 4 of them. The Corsair was simply too fast, too tough, and too heavily armed. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Navy statisticians began the grim work of tallying the score. They looked at the combat reports, the gun camera footage, and the squadron logs. The numbers they found were almost mathematically impossible. In the course of the war, the F4U Corsair had flown 64,051 sorties. It had dropped 15,621 tons of bombs. But the statistic that defined the legend was the kill ratio. In air-to-air combat, the Corsair had destroyed 2,140 Japanese aircraft. In return, only 189 Corsairs had been lost in dogfights. That was a kill ratio of 11 to 1. For every one American pilot lost in a Corsair, 11 Japanese pilots had been shot down. It was the highest kill ratio of any piston-engine fighter in the history of the U.S. Navy. The Ensign Eliminator, the plane that was rejected, the plane that was deemed too dangerous to land, had ended the war as the undisputed king of the Pacific sky. The arithmetic was simple. The Corsair didn't just survive the war, it dominated it. The beast had not only been tamed, it had devoured the enemy.